HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents At What Cost? Modern Capitalism and the Future of Health, First Edition, by Nicholas Freudenberg, read by Stephen Bell Davies. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Preface. 2020 was a banner year for followers of the apocalypse. Massive fires, often aggravated by heat waves and droughts, burned forests and houses in California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado, as well as in Indonesia, Brazil, and Australia. A record-breaking 30 tropical storms or hurricanes hit states on the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, as well as in the Caribbean, killing almost 400 people, destroying homes and communities, and imposing costs of more than $33 billion. And of course there was the COVID-19 pandemic, estimated by the end of 2020 to have infected at least 60 million people, and killed at least 1.5 million around the world. In the United States alone, the pandemic put 30 million people out of work temporarily or permanently, pushing many into hunger and food insecurity, homelessness, and misery. Political apocalypses also proliferated. Around the world, authoritarian, nationalist, anti-democratic, or corrupt governments undermined democracy in Brazil, Turkey, Poland, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, leading to predictions of the collapse of liberal Western civilization. Racial and economic inequality, already at record levels globally and in the United States, further widened, precipitating the largest mass mobilizations in U.S. history. The election defeat of President Donald Trump in November raised hope for a restoration of democracy in the U.S., but the almost 74 million votes he received signaled the continuing support for his brand of denigrating science, challenging norms of decency and compassion, and supporting the ultra-rich. The catastrophes of 2020 amplified a cascade of other long-brewing health and social crises: human-induced climate change, a persistent crisis of affordable housing, growing burdens of chronic diseases, rising deaths of despair from drug overdoses, alcoholism, and suicide in many wealthy countries, increased surveillance and interference with people's private lives through digital technologies, and a level of political polarization and disrespect for truth that jeopardized rational discourse as a strategy for solving problems. While the spectacular disasters of 2020 attracted public and media attention, less noticed were the daily tribulations that ordinary Americans faced in their pursuit of health, life, liberty, and happiness. For the 34 million Americans with diabetes and the 88 million at risk of the disease, every meal can be a battle to find tasty, healthy food they can afford. For the 10 million Americans estimated to have lost their homes in the Great Recession of 2008, or the 500,000 Americans who now sleep on the street every night, safe, stable housing remains an elusive goal. For the 44 million Americans who have outstanding student loan debts totaling more than $1.7 trillion, the American dream of supporting a family, buying a house, and having a better life than your parents often seems out of reach. About 2 in 5 American workers, 53 million men and women, earn low wages, with many lacking benefits, health and safety protections, or the right to unionize. The synergistic impact of these experiences disproportionately affect blacks, Latinx, recent immigrants, and women. Their constant struggles can make day-to-day living an ordeal and undermine self-esteem, dignity, and hope for the future, key foundations of health. Will the human and environmental costs inflicted by the disasters of 2020 and before create new openings for imagining a different, more sustainable world? Or, as we saw in the national response to the 2008 financial crisis, will the nation's commitment to business as usual, whatever the cost, predominate? Will the power that has been concentrated in the hands of corporations and the wealthiest Americans over the last few decades again enable them to resist meaningful changes that improve the well-being of humanity and our planet? These are the questions I explore in At What Cost? My explorations are shaped by my experiences as a public health researcher, practitioner, and activist. For the past 4 decades, I have studied and taught how social, economic, and political forces shape the health of communities and the opportunities for improving health and reducing health inequalities. With community organizations, schools, youth organizations, local government officials, my students, and other health workers, I have contributed to planning, launching, and evaluating health programs and policies created to reduce the health and social problems that threaten well-being in the United States and elsewhere. As an activist, I have had the privilege of participating in and studying many of the social movements that have struggled to create alternatives to health-damaging policies and social structures. 2 centuries of public health history have convinced me that it is the mix of science, public health practice, and social mobilization that leads to improvements in the health of populations. My goal here is to discover the magic blend of these 3 in these times that can reverse the damage to health and the cost to society of recent political and economic changes in the American economy. For many years, those of us who came of age during the Cold War avoided the word capitalism, fearful of its old-fashioned resonance or its risk of precipitating McCarthyite retaliation. Many chose more anodyne terms, free markets, neoliberalism, private sector, hoping perhaps to engage rather than alienate defenders of the status quo. More recently, in public health scholarship, the term commercial determinants of health has been used to describe how markets and the quest for profits shape health and disease, a term that may further obscure the roots of global threats to health. In At What Cost, I choose to use the word capitalism, focusing on the variant that has emerged in the last few decades, what I call modern capitalism or 21st century capitalism. I argue that recent changes in capitalism have precipitated or aggravated both the apocalypses of 2020 and the slower motion disasters of the last 2 decades. In this view, modern capitalism has become the fundamental influence on individual and global health and disease, shaping the spread of pandemics, the impact of human-induced climate change, and the growing burden of chronic diseases like cardiovascular conditions, diabetes, and cancers. Capitalism also creates the actual options ordinary people face in their daily pursuit of what I call the pillars of health: food, education, health care, work, transport, and connections to others. For these reasons, I have come to believe that understanding the economic system called capitalism, its influences on well-being, and its variants and alternatives are essential tasks not only for public health researchers, practitioners, and activists, but also for concerned citizens, reformers, and social movements. For those who seek improvements in global and individual health, avoiding the word and idea of capitalism is like physicians avoiding the mentions of bodies for fear of embarrassing others. By describing the pathways by which recent changes in capitalism have disrupted or complicated people's quest for those pillars essential for health, I hope to spark conversation, debate, and strategizing about alternatives. In a hopeful sign, public opinion polls show that many, especially young people, now question whether capitalism as practiced can safeguard our present and future, and a new generation of scholars are subjecting this system to the intensive scrutiny that may suggest alternative paths. As I discuss in the last chapters of the book, charting ways to reduce the costs to human and planetary health of the current configuration of capitalism does not require one to agree on the specifics of what comes next, or what brand of the many varieties of capitalism and socialism now on offer around the world will follow. But making progress in resolving the grand challenges to well-being facing the world in the opening decades of the 21st century does require some new commitments. Above all, it will require rejection of the dogma that there is no alternative to the world the way it is. It also requires a commitment to collecting and analyzing the evidence that documents the true costs and benefits of the current system, not a faith-based adherence to market fundamentalism, whatever capitalism's costs to current and future generations and our planet. It requires those seeking both incremental and transformative change, and those committed to racial justice, gender justice, environmental justice, food justice, and health justice, to search for common ground, shared agendas, and collective strategies rather than pursuing moral purity, siloed goals, or exclusionary principles. Throughout the book, I profile a few of the many organizations and individuals who are showing the way to forge such unity and highlight the obstacles they encounter. In the United States, as President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris chart their directions for their administration and then begin to implement these plans, these organizations and individuals have the opportunity to, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt once famously put it, make these leaders do the right thing. In 2020, what became clear is that our future could be far worse than our present. But the events of the year also showed, but by acting together, we might muster the vision, power, and strategies for a far better world. As in every prior period in human history, when crises disrupt normal life, they also precipitate new social and political tidal waves that in turn open possibilities and hope in the United States and around the world. In At What Cost, I invite listeners to define a role for themselves in riding these waves to a better, healthier, and more sustainable world. Part 1. Introduction. Chapter 1. The Changing Face of U.S. and Global Capitalism. Well, capitalism is a big problem, because with capitalism you're just going to keep buying and selling things until there's nothing else to buy and sell, which means gobbling up the planet. Alice Walker. Pessimism at Davos. Despite the snow-covered peaks, the crisp mountain air, and the strains of Yo-Yo Ma himself playing Bach's Sixth Cello Suite in the mountain camp, a mood of gloom and uncertainty hung over the 2020 World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Why the ambiance of pessimism among the individuals who lead the world's most powerful corporations and financial institutions? One reason, perhaps, is that a significant number of people around the world were again asking whether the reigning form of capitalism was capable of meeting the world's greatest challenges: climate change, growing inequality, rising nationalism and authoritarianism, continuing financial volatility, epidemics of mental health, chronic and infectious diseases, and increasing deaths of despair. Were the emerging questions about the future of capitalism a real threat, jeopardizing the global economic and political order that had emerged since the 1970s? Or did they promise new opportunities for a healthier, more equitable future? After all, in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, after the Great Depression, and again in the 1960s and 1970s, reformers and activists had organized movements that shook the established order. Was this emerging criticism another blip, like the 2008 financial crisis, a disaster that capitalism ended up using to strengthen its control of the world economy? At the Davos meeting, some participants, like Mark Benioff, chair and co-CEO of Salesforce, a global tech company with 2019 revenues of more than $13 billion, put it bluntly. "Capitalism as we have known it is dead," he said. "This obsession we have with maximizing profits for shareholders alone has led to an incredible inequality and a planetary emergency." Other business leaders tried to put a happier face on the situation. Feike Sijbesma, the chief executive officer and chair of Royal DSM NV, a Dutch transnational food and health corporation, observed, "Business leaders now have an incredible opportunity. By giving stakeholder capitalism concrete meaning, they can move beyond their legal obligations and uphold their duty to society. They can bring the world closer to achieving shared goals, such as those outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement and the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. If they really want to leave their mark on the world, there is no alternative." Stakeholder capitalism, according to the Davos 2020 manifesto, released shortly before the forum, sought to engage all its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. Among those to be included as stakeholders were employees, customers, suppliers, local communities, and society at large. However, to keep all eyes firmly focused on the bottom line, the manifesto went on to observe that the best way to understand and harmonize the divergent interests of all stakeholders is through a shared commitment to policies and decisions that strengthen the long-term prosperity of a company. Tim Wu, the Columbia University legal scholar who writes about the perils of tech company monopolies, observed that, "Walking around Davos, I thought at first I had mistakenly wandered into a business-casual Bernie Sanders rally. Unrestrained capitalism has gone too far. Corporate greed has endangered the planet. The time has come for radical change." Klaus Schwab, the founder and longtime CEO of the World Economic Forum, optimistically added to the happy face spin. "If you aggregate our goodwill and action," Schwab told the Davos participants, "we can say to the next generation, you can rely on us." But at least one next-generation participant, Greta Thunberg, the teenage Swedish climate activist attending her second Davos forum, seemed unwilling to rely on Schwab and his peers. "I've been warned that telling people to panic about the climate crisis is a very dangerous thing to do," Thunberg told the attendees. "But don't worry, it's fine. Trust me, I've done this before, and I can assure you, it doesn't lead to anything." Beneath the competing efforts to frame a global debate, however, the 2020 Davos meeting crystallized the uncertainty among many stakeholders about whether or not the variant of capitalism that emerged in the late 20th century could solve the problems now facing the world. A survey of 1,581 CEOs of global corporations conducted for the 2020 Davos Forum by PwC, a global accounting company, found that more than a third of the corporate leaders were extremely worried about overregulation, trade conflicts, and uncertain economic growth. United States CEOs were more pessimistic than their global peers, with 62% projecting a decline in the pace of their business's growth in the next year, compared to 53% for all CEOs. In the United States, 83% of CEOs were planning operational efficiencies such as cuts in staffing, selling off businesses, or deferring investments to help drive growth. What impact will these efficiencies have on workers, consumers, and the public at large? And what voices will participate in making these decisions? And don't such decisions belie their statements about using the crisis to improve the world? Corporate leaders' concerns about the economy's future are amplified by other economic trends. Although the global economy has expanded for years, productivity has barely budged, suggesting that the previous relationships between growth and increasing productivity might be broken. Broken as well is the long-term relationship between an expanding economy and rising wages. The wealthiest are, of course, earning much more, but incomes are stagnant or declining for the bottom 90% of wage earners. These trends make it impossible to follow the model set up by Henry Ford in the early 20th century, where paying workers more enabled them to buy the Model Ts they were making, fueling consumption and economic growth. Finally, business leaders were worried that the tried-and-true tricks that governments have used to fight off economic downturns in the past may have reached their limits. Between 2008 and 2017, 4 central banks injected $10 trillion into the global economy, but productivity growth continued to stagnate. If corporate leaders' record on improving productivity is poor, their progress on climate change is dismal. True, the proportion of CEOs extremely concerned about climate change had increased by more than 25% since the 2019 survey. In a letter to CEOs sent shortly before the Davos meeting, BlackRock Chief Executive Larry Fink showed that some executives now believe that climate change is a salient threat to their business. This provides a rationale for acting in the interests of that largest of shared stakeholders, the planet itself. Climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects, wrote Fink. But awareness is rapidly changing, and I believe we are on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. He pledged to begin moving those parts of BlackRock's almost $7 trillion of assets it managed out of fossil fuels. However, in 2020, climate change ranked only 11th in the list of the top 15 CEO concerns, despite the International Climate Change Panel's warning that climate change was the gravest existential threat facing the world's land, oceans, economy, health, and social cohesion today. In fact, a report from Greenpeace, the global activist environmental organization released at the Davos Forum, found that banks and pension funds with CEOs attending Davos have collectively made loans or investments in fossil fuel companies to the tune of $1.4 trillion. Illustrating the lack of consensus among global elites, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin used the Davos meeting to ridicule Greta Thunberg and the calls for fossil fuel divestment. "We don't believe there should be carbon taxes," he said. "We want to cut taxes. We think that industry can deal with this issue on its own." Even extreme perils to the planet's future have not overcome differences among capitalism's leaders, jeopardizing the prospects for meaningful action. Another report released at the 2020 Davos Forum, this one from Oxfam International, found that the world's 2,153 billionaires now have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. To address this problem of growing income and wealth inequality, Davos participants would need to make significant changes in tax, trade, wage, education, child care, health care, gender, and economic development policies, an appetite that seemed lacking at Davos. Some participants in Davos did voice support for new thinking. One of the highlights of the meeting was an appearance by will.i.am, described as a creative innovator, futurist, entertainer, technology investor, and founder and chief executive officer of I.am Plus. He told the Davos participants, "It's a brand new decade, y'all. This decade is going to define the rest of freaking humanity." If CEOs left Davos with worries, their fears exploded only a few weeks later as the COVID-19 pandemic infected the world's populations. Not only did COVID-19 kill or sicken millions of people in low, middle, and high-income countries, it also triggered a global economic crisis that rivaled the Great Depression of 1929. Against this backdrop, At What Cost examines what role capitalism plays in shaping the future of the rest of freaking humanity. This book explores how the transformations of 21st century capitalism have changed people's search for well-being and happiness, and for the basic necessities of life: food, health care, education, and work. Far from the glitz of Davos, I investigate ordinary people's encounters with corporations as these individuals pursue their daily tasks and seek health and life satisfaction for themselves, their families, and their communities. I ask whether out of these daily quests, those who seek a healthier, more just, and sustainable world can create new alliances that can, over time, forge another world where human need takes precedence over profit. I focus on the United States, the country I know best, but since the daily experiences of people in the United States are shaped by and shape the experiences of people everywhere, my perspective is inevitably global. Signs of dissatisfaction. It is not only the CEOs who go to Davos who worry about the future. Evidence suggests that most Americans are not happier, healthier, enjoying more freedom, and more confident about their own and their family and friends' future than in the past. Nearly 250 years after the Declaration of Independence proclaimed inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all three are still elusive goals in the United States. Public opinion polls, media reporting, and academic research show that many in the United States are dissatisfied with the current state of our society. Exploring the ways that changes in modern capitalism have contributed to this dis-ease, a growing sense of distrust, disappointed dreams, and social exclusion, can set the stage for considering alternatives. One such 2019 survey of more than 34,000 people in 28 countries, conducted by Edelman, a global communications company, found that only 43% of the U.S. general population believe that they and their families will be better off in 5 years' time, a decline of 7% in just 1 year. More than half the U.S. respondents worried that people like me will lose the respect and dignity I once enjoyed in this country. About half the Americans feared they might lose their job as a result of the gig economy, their lack of training or skills, the looming recession, immigration, or automation, the defining characteristics of this period. Only a few months later, the COVID-19 pandemic turned these fears into reality for millions of people. Americans' willingness to support capitalism has long depended on the belief that it was the system that best offered them the chance to achieve the American dream, a better life than their parents, and opportunities for their children to realize their aspirations. Yet today, 47% of the people in the U.S. Edelman sample agreed with the statement that capitalism, as it exists today, does more harm than good in the world. Among young people, support for capitalism is even lower. A 2016 Harvard University survey found that 51% of Americans...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?